Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz has warned that Europe must reduce its reliance on the United States in response to Washington's new national security strategy. The document criticizes Europe, alleging that it censors free speech and suppresses anti-immigration movements.
The question of what this means for our security cooperation is obviously the most important question. It confirms my assessment that we in Europe, and therefore also in Germany, must become much more independent from the US in terms of security policy.
Let's talk to Sean Bell, the retired Air Vice-Marshal and military analyst. Sean, welcome back to the programme. There you are. Trump's given an interview to Politico where he describes Europe as decaying, led by weak people. He goes on to say Europe doesn't know what to do. They talk, but they don't produce. The war just keeps on going on and on. Is Trump right?
Yeah, good afternoon, Jamie. I mean, it is interesting to reflect that since the Second World War, 80 years ago, the US has been the foundation of NATO, which Europeans have generally exploited. Now, the Ukraine problem is not a NATO problem. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. It's on the European mainland, therefore it's a European problem. And unfortunately, Europe isn't the United States of Europe. It's a bunch of different countries with different politics, different languages, and the like. And that diverse set of nations has largely been held together so far by America's money and influence. But of course now, America's saying, come on, Europe, you need to step up and respond. And a good example of that, I think, is Ukraine is getting money, but it doesn't need money, it needs weapons. The Russians have got their war economy on a war footing, but Europe has yet to do that. And at the moment, as they say, it's soldiers that win battles, but it's industry, it is factories that win wars. And at the moment, Europe hasn't stepped up to the plate.
OK, well, given that and following those Downing Street talks between Zelensky, Starmer, Macron and Merz, where does all of this leave Ukraine?
Well, I think it's fascinating seeing the dynamics of those talks that are happening in Downing Street and Zelensky moving around Europe, because it almost feels like Sir Keir Starmer and others are trying to walk a fine balance to keep Trump engaged, but not agree a surrender plan. Let's be quite clear, that 26-point plan, 28-point plan was largely a surrender plan. Putin is winning on the battlefield, as your correspondent was saying earlier with Sasha. The snag, of course, is why would Putin stop at the moment unless the negotiation gave him everything he thinks he's going to win anyway. The problem, I think, is Trump seems to view this as a negotiation as it was real estate or industry, whereas the harsh reality, this isn't that. This is blood, this is sacrifice, this is communities. But bluntly, unfortunately, Jamie, as you know, there are no good options for Ukraine at this stage.
Why are some EU leaders, we've just talked about Friedrich Merz of Germany, openly arguing that Europe must become much more independent of the United States in security policy?
I think part of it is seeing the way that this negotiation is playing out. Unfortunately, America's largely sidelined the Europeans and is talking directly to Russia and even sidelining Ukraine. Now, EU, the European Union, the European nations know that if the war is ended with Russia, they'll have to live with the consequences of that. And if it is a surrender document, President Trump may well see out the rest of his time and there wouldn't be a further war in Europe. But Europeans know that actually vulnerable Ukraine is a vulnerable Europe, and therefore they want to use their influence, both economic and military, to have a say. Now, at the moment, I have to say, as a former warfighter, the one thing Europe lacks is credibility. There is no agreed line. They're not upping their industrial base to produce the weapons that are vital. And of course, with America appearing increasingly shaky, potentially, as was reported earlier, potentially even considering walking away from this, the Europeans are going to be faced with a really stark choice.
Sean, thank you for that. Sean Bell, the retired Air Vice-Marshal and military analyst.